Hey guys, Ben from Bachphotography here, and today we're looking at a portrait session that I did with model Jasmine Sarah, and I'll link in the description a link to more of her work if you're interested in checking that out. So if you're new here, please like and subscribe and hit that notification bell just so you can get notified whenever I make new content like this. So today we were doing a portrait session with my Sony A7RII and a Sigma 85mm f1.4 art lens. And I'll put a link to all of the equipment that I used in this photo shoot in the description below. I'm also going to leave some of the raw files from this photo shoot in the description below in a Dropbox link, just in case you would like to edit along or have a go at editing these photos. So while we were scouting out this area, we were really lucky to find this house which had a color scheme exactly the same as Jasmine's dress that she was wearing at the time. So we decided to do a few portraits out the front of this house. So in this video, we're going to be looking at the camera equipment I used. We're also going to be looking at the settings in the camera when this particular photo was taken. Then we're going to go through the lighting and also the post-production on this image in Camera Raw and Photoshop. So once again, the camera I used was a Sony A7RII and a Sigma 85mm 1.4. And the aperture we shot this was at f1.6. We shot at a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second and an ISO of 100. So let's talk about why I chose those settings. I chose a aperture of f1.6 because I really wanted to blow out the background of this image. And I tried shooting at 1.4, but for some reason my camera was not focusing properly at f1.4. So I just stopped down to 1.6. It's pretty much the same depth of field to get the sharp image. I shot at a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second because it was quite bright outside, so it meant that I could shoot quite fast to really lock in any movement that her hair was doing and make the image nice and sharp. I shot at an ISO of 100 because this is the base ISO of my Sony camera, and that meant that we would get the best signal to the camera sensor and the highest fidelity image for post-production in Photoshop. So I told Jasmine to take her jacket off for this photo just because I wanted to make it very obvious that her dress was the same color as the window frame that we were shooting at the front of. I also got her to move all her hair on one side just because it makes her hair look more full and thick and also shows off the slenderness of her neck. And also when her hair was on both sides, you couldn't see her dress quite as much, which meant that you weren't able to see the colors between the dress and the window frame. I also got Jasmine to tilt her head up and look at me from the side because that really accentuates the sharpness of her jawline. So finally, before we jump into Photoshop, let's talk a little bit about lighting. So because it was quite late in the day, we managed to find a place that was completely covered in shade. And the reason you want to have shade in your portraits is so that the lighting is all very even and flat in the image. If you can see the sun high up in the sky, it can cause some really harsh highlights and shadows. So having the sun as low as possible and finding somewhere that's completely shaded means that you have the most flexibility in Photoshop when you're editing the image. So now let's jump into Photoshop and edit this image. Remember, in the description there is a Dropbox link to the raw files if you'd like to edit along. And let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in a live stream where we can all edit these photos together. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is going to add some clarity to the entire image just to make Jasmine pop from the background. Next thing we're going to do is drop the shadows a little bit and also boost the exposure up slightly. And then we're going to add a little bit of contrast just because when you're shooting in RAW, the image is going to be a little flatter than it would be in JPEG. Basically so that you have the most flexibility possible in editing. So what we're doing here is just going to drop the exposure, shadows and blacks in the brush tool, so I can use the brush tool as a masking tool. And I'm just going to make a selection of all her hair so that we can edit the hair separately. And what I'm going to do here is just add a little bit of vibrance and change the color balance of her hair very slightly, just to make it pop a little bit more from the image. Because one of the things I really think makes this image is how full and thick and colorful her hair is. So if we make it a little bit more colorful, I think that'll really make the image stand out a bit more. And also we'll make it a little bit more full when we go into native Photoshop in a little bit. Okay, so once we've got an entire selection of the hair, we can get rid of the exposure, of the shadows and the blacks, and then we're just left with the image. And what we'll do then is just add a little bit more yellow, a little bit more magentas, and boost the saturation up a little bit, and as you can see, that really makes her hair stand out a lot more. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get a selection of her skin, and basically we're just going to reset the brush and then drop the clarity slightly and just drop the blacks, the shadows and the exposure all the way down again so that we can use this brush as a masking tool. Just going to mask all of her skin that we want to make a little bit smoother. Now this is quite a rough and dirty way of smoothing skin, and if you want to go super detailed and make the skin look beautiful, it does take probably for an image like this 30 to 45 minutes, and this wouldn't be the technique that you'd use, but in the purpose of time, this is a really great way to just quickly smooth the skin on a model's face. So just making a selection of the places you want to smooth, making sure that we don't want to go over any sharp lines such as her eyes or lips and keeping them nice and sharp, just making the parts of the skin smooth that we want, but keeping the details in there as well. And you can also do this on other body parts. So here we're doing her arm as well. You've just got to make sure not to go over any contrasting lines or any lines that you want to keep sharp, because it will look strange once you drop the clarity on those sorts of areas. So we're just going to do her upper back here as well, and a little bit on her neck, making sure not to hit her jawline, just because that's a part we want to keep relatively sharp. And now we're going to just drop the blacks, drop the shadows, drop the exposure, and then leave that clarity a little bit lower than it was before. So that's a really great way of just smoothing the skin very slightly before we go into Photoshop and do all of the fine changes. So the next thing we're going to do here is just add a little bit more exposure and a little more clarity to her eyes, just to make them pop a little bit more from the image. Now you have to be careful not to go too far with this, because you will give your model laser beam eyes if you make her eyes super bright and super sharp. Next thing I'm going to do is just drop the exposure very slightly, add a bit of clarity as well, and just add a little bit more sharpness into her eyebrows. And I just thought the image would look better, very slightly more warm, so we're just going to boost the warmth up very slightly by adding a little bit of yellow. And that's everything in Camera Raw. Now let's jump into native Photoshop and finish off this image. So the first thing I'm going to do is go onto her face and just get rid of any little blemishes there are on her skin. Now because we were shooting at f1.6 and Jasmine already has really good skin, there really isn't that much to do here. Just getting rid of any small blemishes that we see. So this is the trick you'd want to do without the removal of clarity from the image if you wanted to make her skin look absolutely flawless and you had a whole bunch of time to spend making her skin just look completely smooth and completely perfect. But in the interest of time, using the clarity slider just gives you like a bit of a head start so that you can get rid of any of the big blemishes, or at least smooth them out a little bit, so that when you go into native Photoshop, you don't have as many blemishes to remove with the patch tool. So what we're doing here is I just noticed there was a little bit of redness on her arm. So we're going into the hue saturation, and then when we're in master we can see exactly what color those red spots on her arm are. And then we can go into the reds channel and isolate those colors, just so we can remove the little bits of reddy orange from her arm. So as you can see there, it doesn't just get her arm, so we're just going to reduce the saturation very slightly, just so we can get rid of a bit of redness in her arm without removing all of those oranges from her face as well. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is just go back into Camera Raw, and I'm just going to add a little bit of saturation into her lips. Just because we removed it a little bit with the hue saturation tool before. And also just because red lips always look a little bit more interesting than their less colourful counterpart. So just subtle changes like that, once you've added all of them up, actually make a massive difference. So although you might not be able to tell the difference when I make one little change, once you put all of those little changes together, it makes a big difference to the entire image. Alright, so next thing we're going to do is add a curves layer, and then boost up the highlights a little bit, and then press Control-I or Command-I from a Mac, and we're just going to paint a few highlights into her skin. So just where you can see light parts on her skin, we're just going to make those light parts a little bit more light, just to add a bit more dimension and 3D effect to her face. So I'm just using a very, very soft brush here, only 15% opacity, and I'm also using a brush that fades off on the corners very rapidly. So just adding a bit to her shoulder there as well, a bit to her nose, a bit to her cheekbones, and that sort of thing. So I'm just going to flatten that image as well. It's always important to have a backup copy of your image, just because this sort of editing is destructive editing. So we're going to do the same thing again, but for shadows. So just making a new curves layer, dropping those shadows, and then pressing Command-I or Control-I, and just adding a little bit more darkness to the dark parts of her face and hair. So again, these changes are all very, very subtle, but once you add all of them together, it really does make a dramatic difference to the image. So just adding a little bit more darkness to her jawline there as well, a little bit more to her eyebrows as well, and a bit to the eyelashes, and then just a little bit in the dark parts of her hair. Alright, so that's the final image, and here is a comparison of the before and the after on the final image too. And just remember to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. I'll be making a lot more like this in the future. And if you're interested in checking out any of the equipment I used on this photo shoot, there'll be links in the description, and it really helps me out a lot if you do check those out. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you in the next one.